The Hybrid, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus, read by the author. Check out the playlist linked below for more narrations set within this post-apocalyptic universe. It is advised you listen to the first two videos in this loosely connected series for some important context about the setting all the videos are set within. It had been over 20 years since the fall of the civilized world, a fall brought on by an event simply referred to as the anomaly, which resurrected all the prehistoric animals to have ever lived on the Earth over a period of a few years. Human civilization hung on as long as it could, but as food chains and the natural ecological order of the world fell into chaos, so did civilization. And by the time the world settled and adapted to the changes, modern civilization was not among the things to survive. Various groups of human survivors pulled together into communities and began again as best they could. Some worked together to further build back what was lost. Others tried to take what others had. The Patriots were one such group. It had been 10 years since they had started a brutal and bloody conflict with a neighboring coalition of communities, and by the time it was over, the united communities they had assaulted had beaten the aggressors back and the Patriots had surrendered, with many of the original leaders on their council, who were determined to see the war drag on until they won, were forced out by the same members of their own military force, and new faces were put in charge who could actually change the community for the better. 10 years later, though, extremists within the walls of the community were still not satisfied. Many of them ones who'd fought in the war, or leaders who had overseen it that managed to avoid arrest. And they were working in the shadows to try and undo the defeat the Patriots had been dealt, and put them back on the top of their own twisted view of the world. Of their many ideas to achieve this goal, one had come to fruition that the extremists hoped would start that change. A closely guarded secret that one new recruit for the Patriots military was about to stumble into, along with a conspiracy. That morning, all was quiet in the section of the abandoned city that the Patriots had walled off and made their own. Despite the feelings of some on the matter, the reality was that, as a community, they were still limited on the number of guns they were allowed to possess. According to the strict doctrine of surrender they had signed, it wouldn't be until at least 15 years after the war before that fact would be subject to re-examination. So, in order to compensate for the low supply of guns, only on-duty guards were allowed to have access to the limited armory. Weapons were also only given to the limited number of actual soldiers when they needed them, but they hadn't used them for anything other than basic training for 8 years. The last time they had been in a situation that they needed to use them on people was 8 years prior, when a small group of people in ghillie suits who had been hiding in the forest attempted to kill a group of patriots leaving on a scavenging mission. There had been a small firefight in the forest that same day, with a squad of patriot soldiers engaging in a shootout with a near invisible enemy that had been armed with deathly accurate sniper rifles. The last time the Patriots had used them in an actual combat situation had been almost 2 years before, when a pack of audionaraptors started attacking groups on patrol at the border of the Patriots' territory. The dinosaurs had been covered in tan and red feathers, with gray scaly skin and predatory green eyes. The hunt had lasted months, and the dinosaurs had proved to be smart and elusive throughout, vanishing into the forest with seeming unnatural ease. Throughout all of it, the Patriots only killed 2 of them before the pack decided to leave the area. It was a sudden, brutal reminder of how dangerous dinosaurs really were after so many years without a major incident. But that was a different kind of danger than the kind presented when malicious people were a threat. The going was tough, but the Patriots made as much use out of what they had as they were able. Nonetheless, they marched on with heads held high. Despite the limited guns, new recruits to the military force of the Patriots were often welcome, and arms were shared among them. Recruits were trained and used to protect the city, or patrol the territory once they had begun active duty. Of these new recruits, one was named Dylan Fitzpatrick. He had only been a 10-year-old child during the war. His training was now complete, and he was ready to be given his first assignment. Colonel, the highest-ranking man in the military and its overseer, was the man who passed out the assignments to individuals or squads at the start of each day, and he had been placed in that position during the aftermath of the war. He was one of the few of the original military hierarchy the old leaders had organized to remain in power. Despite the close relation he'd had with those original leaders, he hadn't been among those relieved of power after the war. Many under his command noted that he never seemed to truly get past the fact the Patriots, the soldiers he was in charge of training at the time, had lost. The colonel, who had reached that military rank before the apocalypse, still wore his old uniform. Each day, wearing it with perfection superlative detail, he'd stand before the rest of the Patriots' military personnel and assign each person their daily jobs. In times of peace, most found they simply worked one day at a time jobs on most days. Dylan stood up straight, as his name was called. "Patrolling the sub-level tunnel system underneath the labs," the colonel told him. Great. Dark, underground tunnels full of empty cages where the army that never came to be would have been kept. Nothing there but leaky pipes, concrete so stained it was brown, dim buzzing yellow lights, and mildew. Wonderful. "Sir, there's nothing down there. Why do I have to patrol it?" "See to it that it stays there's nothing down there. Get a weapon from the armory before you go. I have a written statement here granting you access. Dismissed." "A weapon? Sir, why do I need that if there's nothing down there?" Dylan asked. "Wouldn't it find better use elsewhere?" He didn't get an answer. The colonel simply turned his head away from him and read off the next name on the list, and that person's respective assignment. Dylan sighed in frustration and grabbed the paper slip he'd showed to the armory guards. Don't feel bad," one of the recruits Dylan had trained with said to him. "Apparently he always seems to single someone out for that job. Must have his reasons. Maybe he sees something in you." In the cage, the dinosaur watched people pass him. He had black scales, green eyes which lacked discernible pupils that glowed with bright bioluminescence. His cage was so dark that, due to his black scales, his eyes would often be the only part of him you could see. He would often scratch the floor and walls of the concrete room just for sound, or to get his anger out. His claws were so dense that they'd leave deep, easily visible marks behind without being dulled. The bars didn't offer the same effect, nor did the iron door next to them. Scratching those offered nothing but the tease of freedom being so close, yet so impossible to access. His life had been in the dark cage. He knew nothing else beyond the walls. He had been made by the people in the lab coats he watched walk past, and wanted nothing more than to sink his large claws into them. But that was a passing fantasy for the dinosaur, and nothing more beyond that. He knew that much. The people in the lab coats didn't care about him. They didn't care that he wanted to kill them, and he knew that he couldn't reach them. The hybrid also knew that they had plans for him, but what they were was something he could only guess at. And with years continuing to pass without change, who knew how long it would be until he learned what they wanted him for? 7 years in this cage, he thought with a hiss. Dunkleosteus for armor, Spinosaurus for strength, Utahraptor for speed. It stood about 10 feet tall, had huge arms, armor on its whole body, the spiky tail of a Stegosaurus, the killing toe claws of a Utahraptor, the sail of a Spinosaurus, the twin crests of the Dilophosaurus, the head of an Allosaurus, and the powerful jaws of the Tyrannosaurus rex. Following the war, it took 3 years of secretive research, but the creature was made. The idea prevailed. Version 1 had been born. Dylan walked through the dark tunnels. The lights overhead that weren't out were a dim yellow. Only the lights in the main corridors still worked. The side corridors were pitch black and seemed to lead off into a void. The unease the tunnels gave off was enough to make Dylan rest his hand on the trigger of his weapon. He passed empty cells of varying sizes on each side. Each was a concrete room, long stained brown from years of being unmaintained and being eroded on by the ever-damp air. Each cell was lined with bars along the wall that met the corridor so the scientists could observe what creation was inside. And they each also had an iron door that a person could enter if they so wished. It was made by those who'd run the lab back in the 1950s when it was originally in operation and done all manner of unethical experiments, and had been intended to be repurposed for holding an army that never came to be. It was disturbing, and the areas without any light didn't help. Lining the ceiling of the tunnels, which likely were originally only maintenance tunnels for the building above before it was a lab and before being converted into an underground prison, were rusted pipes, likely gas, steam, or water, some of which were dripping at joints or around rusted valves. The tunnels were very extensive, and were more like a giant maze in terms of layout. Most had exits and basements of buildings, but a few actually ended in stairs that led up to the streets above. Most of the corridors were also dark, with only the main passages remaining illuminated, and some of the tunnels had even been permanently sealed off. Dylan didn't want to think about what secrets might have been sealed off with them and forever buried. There was no one else on this level. Access was strictly controlled, so why he had to patrol there was beyond him. And every time Dylan passed one of the few branching tunnels that went off into darkness, his mind imagined something charging out of them, its arms reaching out for him. He shook his mind to clear it and moved on. He didn't need to scare himself when there was nothing there. Nothing in any of the dark corridors, and nothing in any of the unused cells. So he thought. As he was following along one of the better illuminated tunnels, he thought he caught a glimpse of something in what was likely just another empty cage among the hundreds. To appease his own mind, he took a few steps backwards and glanced through the bars. After a few seconds of staring, he noticed what he'd almost overlooked seconds prior. At the back of the empty cage, where there was no light reaching at all, was a shape that was even darker than the surrounding darkness. He then jumped back in both surprise and fright as a loud snort, accompanied by movement in the blackness, issued out of the cell. Two glowing green orbs appeared and stared at him from the darkness inside, unblinking, but very much alive. Both glinting with the hope that he would step just a little closer to the bars. Dylan took a step back to the opposite wall instead, shaking slightly at the sudden appearance of a form inside of what was supposed to be an empty cell inside of an abandoned tunnel network where he was supposed to be the only thing alive. Dylan watched with wide eyes as, slowly, a hand with 4 clawed fingers emerged from the darkness, scratching on the floor lightly as the thing in the cage slowly emerged into the illuminated half of the cell. Its jaws appeared next. Dylan first saw the teeth, then the drool dripping from its half-open maw. It was a dinosaur. That was obvious, but it looked weird, and he could not identify it. Its head was adorned with the twin crests from a Dilophosaurus, and it was also covered in a layer of what looked like the bony, shielding armored plates off of a Dunkleosteus's head and thorax. The plates which covered its head also extended down its neck and then along its upper back. It clicked the large sickle toe claws of a Utah raptor on the concrete floor. It studied Dylan for several seconds, never fully making itself visible. Then the look in its eyes changed. It snorted again and turned its back on Dylan, lying down with a sail that looked like it was from a Spinosaurus now facing him. Dylan realized what the animal was. The perfect weapon that had been in development years ago. The project was supposed to have been cancelled immediately after the war ended. Apparently, it had not been. The outcome was the hybrid dinosaur he was now just feet away from in the dark underground tunnel. Dylan knew he should have run, but his curiosity was too great. So he walked up to the bars and looked inside, wanting a better look at the thing. Son of a bitch. They actually made it, he muttered, wondering how long the hybrid had been down there. The hybrid's head turned around to face him again, and it snarled, causing Dylan to jump back out of its reach. The dinosaur looked him up and down again, examining him, especially his face. "You're definitely not one of them in the coats," it said. No, I'm not. I was just wondering if... Are you okay?" Dylan managed to say, making up the sentence as he went along and just hoping to string something coherent together. The hybrid looked away from him for a second. Then it snarled and wheeled around to face him again. "Am I okay? Am I okay? No, I'm not okay!" it roared, getting to its feet and stomping up to the bars. "How do you think it is to only know a single cage your entire life? You take so much for granted just being able to walk down these tunnels." It backed off a few steps, dropping onto all fours as it continued speaking, its head now at eye level with Dylan's. "You don't have to spend your whole life in the dark, being starved and experimented on and tortured just for fun." Now being in the light again, Dylan could make out more of its features. He could see its body shape was somewhat similar to a velociraptor, but not exactly the same, and the long arms allowed it to either stand on its own two legs or walk down on all fours, like it currently was. The hybrid again snorted and turned away, smacking the bars with its tail, causing a loud bang to echo down the tunnel. Dylan saw the plated armor ran down the top side of its tail, which had a set of Stegosaurus thagomizers at the end. The hybrid retreated back into the darkness and laid down, its eyes hidden, and the darkness now completely hiding the dinosaur from view. Dylan couldn't see it, but the animal was shaking, and there were silent tears falling from the dinosaur's eyes. One of the very few times it allowed the stabbing waves of despair to actually leak out instead of just keeping it all bottled in, turning into burning rage or hate, or just crying crocodile tears instead. The flare-up of emotions had been enough, and the seething anger turned to shattering despair, a wave so powerful that the hybrid couldn't hold it in. "Sorry, I didn't know," Dylan called after a moment. "It's not your fault," the dinosaur said. Like Dylan, he was not sure why he was still continuing the conversation. "I've never seen you, so I know you're not part of the reason that I'm here," it muttered. Dylan felt horrible for the poor thing, and, though he knew it was a stupid idea, his nature of just wanting to help things in need got the better of him. His brain was telling him to walk away, but he could only make his legs step towards the iron door. Using the keys he had been given, Dylan unlocked it and stepped just inside the cage, keeping the door, which was too small for the dinosaur to escape through, open, and he remained within a few steps of it. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he didn't even get to speak. The hybrid's tail suddenly swung out of the darkness, and it tripped him, making him fall and slam his head on the concrete. Between the spinning stars he was seeing, Dylan could make out the hybrid looming over him, almost seeming to materialize out of the darkness. As his vision cleared, it slammed its right hand down onto his chest and pinned him to the spot, lowering its head and sniffing him. "That was a fairy," Very stupid thing you just did, the dinosaur said, keeping Dylan pinned to the floor under his hand. It snarled and lifted its other hand. I haven't eaten in more than a week, so I'll say thank you for being an idiot. It slowly began to lower its hand, its claws gleaming in the dim light. It also parted its jaws eagerly, salivating and licking its lips. Dylan squeezed his eyes shut, knowing this was the one time his good nature was actually going to be the death of him. The pain didn't come. The dinosaur just seemed to lose interest. You're not the one I want to kill. You're as ignorant of all this as you are stupid. As hungry as I am, you're innocent and don't deserve death, it grumbled, stepping back away from Dylan and returning to the darkest area of the cell, leaving Dylan on the floor with nothing more serious than a bad headache. Dylan laid where he was for a few moments, surprised he hadn't been gutted and eaten on the spot. When he finally sat up after a few minutes of laying on the floor, he glanced at his weapon, which was on the ground by the door, but he didn't reach for it. He looked back at the hybrid and saw it had curled itself up along the far wall, and this time he could see the tears that were falling from its eyes. Dylan had a feeling telling him that they weren't crocodile tears, but real ones from pent-up emotion. Dylan stood, and since it hadn't killed him already, he decided to take a chance. He slowly approached the dinosaur and sat down by its head. He hesitantly reached out and gently and comfortingly began to stroke its nose. It opened its eyes again and they locked gazes. You didn't leave, it said. Am I still stupid? Dylan asked. The hybrid just looked at him for a moment and then placed its head in his lap. Don't leave, please. I don't want to be alone, it whispered, now sounding like a child wanting comfort rather than an angry, sadistic creature. Okay. I, I can stay a while. And I'm assigned here too, so I can come around again tomorrow and every other day, if you'd like that. Dylan replied, and the hybrid let out a slow, content sigh, sounding pleased with the idea of a friendly interaction daily, instead of only the ones that resulted in more pain. Thank you, it said, lifting its head and looking Dylan in the eye again, its snout so close that it caused Dylan to lean back slightly. No problem. Did they give you a name? Dylan replied after a moment of silence. 000001, it said. That made perfect sense. He was the first. It also indicated they, whoever allowed for the creation of the animal to still take place illegally, planned to make more. Lots more. That's no name. That's just a number. You'll need a real one, Dylan said, taking a moment to look the dinosaur over fully. Up close, he saw that all the things he'd speculated were correct. It indeed had thick armor, thagomizers on its tail, and the Utahraptor's infamous sickle claws on the inner toe of each foot. He also noticed the hybrid's ribs were very exposed. It was obviously not fed very well. Probably just enough to keep it alive, if Dylan had to guess. That made Dylan a little nervous, but he wasn't really scared the hybrid would eat him now. But the possibility that it could lose control did linger in the back of his mind. Thank you again, the hybrid said. It seemed to like the idea of actually being given a real name rather than a number. And with another sigh, it placed its head back on Dylan's lap. Some time passed, and 000001's head was still resting on Dylan's lap, and Dylan could hear its stomach growling. The hybrid was giving Dylan a strange look, but it kept itself under control. Dylan knew that the dinosaur likely thought he looked appetizing, but it didn't make a move to hurt him. The amount of restraint it had was remarkable. "Do you have any food?" it finally asked. "Just some dry jerky," Dylan replied, pulling a bag from his pocket and pulling out a tiny piece. "It's all they gave me for my lunch today," Dylan said. The dinosaur opened its jaws, and Dylan placed all the dried meat inside on its dry tongue. 0.00001 swallowed it all inside. Dylan knew such a small bit wouldn't make a difference, but there was nothing more he could do. The only other thing it could have eaten was Dylan, and he felt that he'd much rather not be lunch at that moment. Dylan was still caught off guard when the hybrid's arm wrapped around him suddenly, tightly squeezing the only thing to have ever shown it care with passive strength. It held Dylan against its body and spoke. "I know that didn't help my empty stomach, but what you did there was more than the people who've created me have ever done. So, thank you," the dinosaur whispered. "I see you actually are someone I can call a friend. I promise you that I'll never hurt you." Dylan nodded, feeling the hybrid's arm wrapped around his waist. "I'll try to maybe swipe some fish or something on my way down here tomorrow, okay? No guarantee I can pull it off, but I'll try." The hybrid's tail swayed over the floor approvingly at the idea, and it held him even tighter for a brief moment. In a way, they were very similar, Dylan came to realize. Two lonely souls within their own types of cages. Maybe as friends, they'd both be able to find something to smile about. Now, he had a reason to like his assignment. Several floors above, two individuals were discussing the very animal Dylan had just formed a bond with. "The asset refuses to follow orders. I believe it is the lack of having a human in charge of it. Less interaction. I told you this before it hatched. No human ever bonded with it. Instead, it and its sibling were allowed to develop on their own while only experiencing pain from humans around them. I say that doesn't matter. Version 1 was always expected to be unused in the end as plans began to evolve. The next one will be the first true masterpiece." Ian, the scientist at the head of the whole hybrid creation, said. "It's already been designed, with the exception of a few details I'm still going back and forth on. Built off the base of the original, but superior in every way to it. Deadly on land and in the water. Every last detail thought of. A perfect animal. One that is designed for killing and combat. Version 2 will be my true masterpiece. He will be the most dangerous animal that will ever walk on the planet. Even evolution could never cook up something like him. He could kill a Giganotosaurus on his own, and he's only slightly taller than version 1. His eyes went to the container on his shelf, still housing the remains of a sample they took from another animal so long ago. One that had made it all possible. One who had been the final piece of the puzzle. He never got to perform the autopsy on that animal that he wanted to do, something he regretted. The aftermath of the war had been a true detriment to progress. But it hadn't stopped him, and the specimen's legacy had a lasting impact on Ian's work. That legacy was the DNA that had been taken from the animal after a sample was removed from it. Some of the DNA in it had been used to create and bring 0.00001 to life, who would then be used as the base to bring all other versions to life in due time. needs to interact with people. The next one must have a commanding parental figure. At the very least, someone it knows is in charge, or it will also have more free will than we want and may not follow orders. You also have to assure Miller of this. He is already threatening to wash his hands of our research and frame us for terrorism, of all things. And he could easily get away with it too, with how many laws you insist we violate in the name of science. The failure of version 1 is giving him cold feet, especially with the sibling dead. I've told you many times that your methods of trying to make version 1 submit to orders were not ideal. They've only made it defiant. We should have provided a nurturing environment for it to grow and train in. Ian smiled. Tim, your concern is noted. I will speak to Miller soon. But we need to do this as quickly as we can. After all, an army may be useful if we ever decide to retry the old game. Ian, you go too far. We aren't going to try to retake the United Communities of Ohio over. This whole project was meant to be for protecting us and our people, since we hardly have any guns anymore. Now, on the topic of protection, your idea that version 1 will eventually submit without outside stimuli appears to be incorrect, considering that 7 years have passed since its birth. For version, not everyone agreed to existing as equals, Tim. Not everyone agreed, Ian said, cutting his fellow off. What are you talking about? Ian met Tim's eye a moment and then said, on the topic of version 2, what if we added Titanoboa DNA and gave the next hybrid some of its physical features? Unhinging jaw and thermal vision, for example? I also had an idea for the use of DNA from the Adestus shark. Adestus, by the way, is translated from the words to devour in Greek, which makes it appropriately foreboding, and by weaving its DNA into version 2's genetics, you can use some of the shark's rather scary physical features. The structure of the teeth from the Adestus, for example, would make for a more frightening appearance. Sir, what do you mean by not everyone agreed? Tim interrupted, not able to hold back his suspicions over Ian's statement. You'll see soon, Ian replied. You will see soon. For now, just keep putting that brilliant brain of yours to use. Version 2 will never exist if we don't work together. And the progress on version 3 has slightly pulled ahead, which is not what we want. I want them born around the same time, but if version 2 remains stalled, then that's not going to happen. Tim took a step forward. Sir, you specifically told me these hybrids would be used for defense of the community in place of our lack of guns. That's what you sold me on to make me go against the law and help you with this project. But I've read everything you want for version 2. That, and along with what you just said, it sounds more like you want to create a monster than something to protect us. Why would we need an animal designed for defense to be scary looking? Ian regarded Tim with a smile. Version 2 will solve all of our problems, he simply said. The next morning, Dylan walked down the dark tunnels once again. The dim lights and dark patches no longer unnerved him. Instead, he just hurried through the tunnels until he arrived back at the cage the hybrid was in. I'm back, he called, opening the door. The dinosaur looked up and seemed happy he was there. Thank you. I was a little worried you wouldn't come back, it said. Dylan chuckled, sitting his gun down by the door, walking over and sitting down by the animal. Well, after you've been pinned under something that threatens to kill and eat you, but then it doesn't, you grow to trust them. The hybrid leaned forward and affectionately licked Dylan's face in greeting, and then he motioned Dylan to come closer. Dylan obliged and moved against the dinosaur's side, resting against its flank, feeling the rigid Dunkleosteus armor poking him in the back. So, I told you you needed a name. Well, I have one if you want to hear it, Dylan said. Really? Well, let me hear it. I hate my current one, the hybrid replied. Well, I thought it would perfectly suit you since when I first saw you, you were almost invisible in them. What do you think of shadow? Dylan asked. Hmm, the hybrid thought about it, tapping its finger claws on the floor lightly. Then it said, I like it. That's my name from now on, he declared, curling his body around Dylan, causing Dylan to chuckle slightly and rub Shadow's nose, which was also as hard as a rock due to the placoderm armor that covered his head. Dylan couldn't help but wonder just how the people who'd made Shadow had worked out mixing so many types of DNA into a single animal. The armor even covered parts of the Dilophosaurus crests on Shadow's head, mostly around the bases of them, but not all of them. Dylan couldn't understand how so many different animals could be seamlessly fused together into one. Glad you like it. I thought you would, Dylan said, returning his focus to Shadow's name. Shadow purred and tightened his embrace ever so slightly. As he did, Dylan's eyes noticed Shadow's exposed ribs again. Shadow truly looked as if he was just fed enough to keep him alive and give him enough strength to move, and nothing more. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to sneak down here with some fish or anything for you to eat, Dylan commented. Shadow snorted gently. It's okay. The company of a friend is enough for me to be happy, he replied, his glowing green eyes looking into Dylan's own. That was another thing Dylan still wondered about as well. He knew that it had to be some form of bioluminescence, like deep sea fish, that resulted in the solid green orbs glowing in Shadow's skull. As they sat together, Dylan continued noting other telling details about Shadow. Each one a telling sign that every piece of Shadow had been carefully chosen. The Utah Raptor claws on his feet were intimidating, and Dylan was still grateful Shadow hadn't used them on him the day prior. Shadow's tail was long, and no doubt also a dangerous weapon, especially with those stegosaurus spikes at the end, which were growing straight out of the plated armor covering the upper side of Shadow's tail. Everything about Shadow, from his pointed teeth to his intelligence to his armor, screamed that he was made to be a weapon. Dylan also noticed for the first time that something had been burned onto Shadow's arm, the number 000001. So that was where the name came from. Shadow, if I could get you out of here, I would. You don't deserve to be trapped here, Dylan said. There's no sunlight, or wind, or space. I wouldn't wish this on my truest enemy, if I had one. Shadow purred a little in response. I know, and I appreciate that. You know, they were here earlier today, and they shocked me just because they wanted to. The man in charge of the one in the white coats. I'm sorry, Dylan said. You don't have anything to be sorry for. You're not the one doing it. If you ever got your claws on them, what would you do? I'd kill them, very slowly and painfully. I'd use my claws to cut them, maul them with my teeth, make them feel my pain, Shadow said, fantasizing for one of the countless thousands of times about carrying out the act. The desire to carry out such an act, the want to unleash the rage that was pent up inside him, was so strong it made Shadow begin to shake slightly from just imagining it. Dylan put a hand on his nose, and the touch caused Shadow to calm down. Understandable, Dylan said. Completely. I know I'd feel the same way, and I'm the kind of person who just wants to make people feel better most of the time. Do my part to help, you know? Shadow brought his spiked tail around and added it to the layer already curled around Dylan. You're a good person, he said. Only one Dylan I ever have known. They're just evil. Dylan found that he still didn't understand. The scientists were most definitely the people in the white coats, but if they'd gone against the law and made Shadow after the project was canceled, then that meant someone higher in the ranks of the Patriots knew about it. The question Dylan had was, what purpose did they have for allowing the hybrid to be made, and what goal were they trying to reach? Dylan also realized that he had no way of guessing who was in on the plot and who wasn't, meaning that for now there wasn't anyone he could trust to report what he'd come across to. If he told the wrong person, he might very well be silenced, because it was clear that whatever was going on, it was being kept hidden by some who didn't want others to know about it. To be continued. The Hybrid, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus. That was a little bonus narration to cap off Wave 2. I decided to do another one simply because I just enjoy making these too much. I have a lot of fun doing these, and I realized that you all hadn't met Shadow yet, who is a pretty big character in the book, so I wanted to do a narration introducing him. And yeah, so not much else to say, really. I took a break from making videos because I was on vacation, but now I'm home, and content should resume. So yeah, I hope you look forward to it, and if you haven't listened to the other narrations in this series, then please check out the playlist linked below. It has all of them in the order that they occur in. So yes, thank you all for listening, and I will see you in the next video.